Well, first off, Joanne, tell our listeners a little about yourself, like where you were born and raised, educated, and work experiences.
I was born and raised in Seattle, Washington. I had a wonderful mother who was a teacher and who taught me to love reading for as long as I can remember, and especially poetry. We read poetry anthologies from the time I could begin to understand words. And so I always loved that. But my young life was also marked with a lot of tragedy and sorrow. My father died of cancer when I was 10. My sister had died actually before I was born. And my beloved grandfather was in a terrible car accident and was handicapped, and that was a terrible experience. We were in hospitals a lot, so I decided I wanted to be a nurse and went to Seattle University on a nursing scholarship. But when I got to the floor of the hospital, I couldn't do it. It was just everybody was my dad or my grandpa, and my supervisor finally said, "You're a great gal with a big heart, but you can't do this work, at least not now." So I went on and majored in English and followed my heart and married one of my English professors and lived kind of an academic life for many years and wrote poetry. I published my first poem when I was 10 years old.
When did you start writing? Was that?
When I was just a little girl. My mother always encouraged me. I wrote short stories and poetry, but my love was always poetry. And when I got to college beyond the nursing, I wrote and published poetry and went on to do that for a number of years. Had my first book published when I was like in my 20s and had two more after that. And then went through a divorce and came back to, we were in Illinois at the time. My husband was an English professor and we were at Illinois State and went through a divorce. Came back to Seattle. My mother had cancer at the time and I had two little kids. And went through a lot of hard years actually. And I wrote off and on, published another book. But all my life I had this desire, need, or what I felt was a calling to actually do something in the healthcare field. Actually, by then I wasn't an English teacher anymore. I was a professional librarian. I have a master's degree in library science. And I liked that work, but in a way it was something that was easy for me. I felt like I was called to do that too, and I certainly believe in the free speech part of librarianship. And it was a good living for a single mom. But I really felt that I was supposed to do something a little more. I always had a secret fantasy to go in the Peace Corps. I never did that. But anyway, so when I was almost 50 years old, I went back to nursing school with a desire to be a hospice nurse. And I did that. And it wasn't easy. I was going to school with little gals that had graduated with my youngest child, and they all wanted to be helicopter rescue nurses.
Hold it just a minute.
Anyway, so I went and I got my registered nursing degree, and I did home health and hospice, and I have done that off and on now for about 13 years. Well, when I first went into nursing, especially the hospice work, of course it's very, very, very intense, very emotional, but I felt it was a wonderful thing that I could do to give back to people and to help them be comfortable and peaceful on their last journey. But I didn't really write in those years at all. I had no emotion left to do anything, really. Until I got this one wonderful patient whose name was Jess Spielholtz, and he came on hospice when he was 98 years old. And after a year, and he hadn't died yet, they kicked him off of hospice. He supposedly had a lung tumor, but it didn't progress, and he was still feisty and kicking. And he lived kind of over by me, so even after he was no longer my patient, I continued to visit him. And he was his great love also, he was a physician by profession, but his great love was also poetry. So Jess and I read poetry and wrote poetry together for a couple of years. And he really encouraged me to go back to that. He said, nursing is wonderful and you're a good nurse, but poetry is where your soul is, and we must never forget the importance of that. So after he passed away, his son contacted me and said, Jess left something for you in his will. And I assumed it was some of his books, which I would have loved to possess, of course. But it actually was a trip to Paris. I had never been abroad, and Jess left us 2 weeks in Paris. And at first, of course, I didn't feel I could accept the gift, but his son, Jess's son, was adamant that that was one of Jess's final requests. And Jess had told him, you know, Joanne's a very good poet, but she's not a great poet. And she's not a great poet because she's never been to Paris. So my husband Jim and I spent 2 weeks there, and I wrote every single day. And we visited, of course, all the wonderful museums, the d'Orsay and the Louvre and the Pompidou and all the wonderful places. And it was just like the most incredible 2 weeks of our lives. And ever since that trip, I've written diligently and seriously, and taken Jess's advice. And now, since of course I've been to Paris, I am a great poet. I can say that.
So that was a real stimulus to your writing.
It was a stimulus to my writing. I'd always written privately, and I know I've published over the years because that's a good incentive sent off, and I have boxfuls of little journals that contain my work, and that's cool. But I really honestly believe my work has improved, not only because I visited Paris and knew Jess Spielholtz, but because actually of the work I had done with the dying, and kind of the spiritual nature of that. Not that my work is any more spiritual than it ever was, but there is a dimension to it, I think, that it didn't have before. So in the last 3 years or so, I've written more and published more than I had in the whole previous 10 to 15 years or so. And I've felt that I'm more successful at it, and more comfortable, and certainly more committed. So that's where I am, and that's the short story of my life.
Well, tell me, what particular writers would you say have been your mentors or your inspiration?
Oh, I love all sorts of different poets. The classical poets, of course, but also modern poets who I've always loved. Galway Kinnell. I love, right now I'm into Tony Hoagland. I think he's hilarious. Of course, I love Billy Collins. I love, who else? Ivor Winters I picked up the other day. I think he's a brilliant poet. Rita Dove, I think she's a beautiful poet. Natasha Trethewey, who's our poet laureate, I believe. Her depiction of what it is to be black in the South and be her multiple heritage, to be able to put some of those things in words. Terrence Hayes, who's a poet whose work is so affected by music and jazz. I really enjoyed reading his because I feel like sometimes I need a little more music in my verse. I could go on and on. I just love reading and writing poetry, but finding a new poet to love is just wonderful.
All right. Well, listen, I understand that you have a publisher for a collection of your poetry. Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Well, of course, it's always cool. You have all these poems in journals, and you have drawers full of poems. But it really is great to have a little book. So people like your work, you can sell them a copy or give them a copy, and you can use it for reading. So I've been working on a collection for the past few years called Believing the Body, which has a lot of poems about my patients and their caregivers and whatnot. And twice before I thought I had a publisher, and for various reasons the deal fell through. And I've been a finalist now in 3 contests for a book or chapbook of poems, but I was finally a finalist in the Gribble Press chapbook contest, and they're out of Spokane. And since I was the first runner-up, they also agreed to publish my book. So that should be coming out just after the first of the year in 2014.
I think weren't you a grand prize winner in this year's dancing poetry contest in San Diego as part of the annual arts festival?
I was.
And
San
I
Francisco.
understand that you won
Yeah.
in a very large competition.
Yeah, that was an amazing thing. You know, I get poets and writers and Duotrope and all those things, and you see these places you can publish your work or contests you can enter. And I saw that listing in Poets and Writers, and I thought the grand prize was to have your poem choreographed and danced at the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. And I thought, boy, wouldn't that be something? And you can send 3 poems, so I sent 3 poems. And lo and behold, I won the contest. I gotta say, I was stunned. It had a number of prizes. There was grand prize, first, second, third. They all had a little bit of money, and I thought, you know, what the heck? But I was so surprised. And so we went down there to see it perform. And this is going to be one of the most amazing things of my life. They did the most gorgeous job. I can't describe. The poem, I can see why they picked the poem in that it worked well for what they did with it. It was called Seamstress Masters Her Craft. And it was about a grandmother teaching a little girl to sew. But it was based on, and actually experiences we had in Paris. I've always liked fabric. I like fashion too. And we viewed all the great masters. It's amazing how much time they spent on the cloak of one saint, And so I thought, what a great way to learn to sew would be to visit museums and see how garments should fall and drape queens and saints and sinners. And so anyway, I'd done a sketch of that poem but never finished it. So when I was trying to think of something to enter in that contest, I completed that poem, and that's the one that won. And while they danced, they had rolls of fabrics they wound around the dancer. And the last line of the poem is something about how the soul must feel this close to the skin. And they took this gossamer white fabric and wound it around this one dancer like a soul. It was really a stunning performance. I gotta say, I was very impressed with the dance and very honored that they could do that with my work.
Well, that's great. Well, tell me, what moves you to pick up a book and read it, and how do you decide what to read?
Well, you were saying a moment ago that you have a collection and every day you try to read a poem or two. And I try to start my day that way too. It's when I have a little quiet time. We have, as I mentioned, family members living with us now, and I have kind of a hectic life. But I try to get up first thing a little earlier than anybody else and spend some time just reading a poet. And I have a couple of anthologies and then whatever book I'm working on. I tend to pick up books that I hear about or read about that have won prizes, or some ones off my shelf that I hadn't read for a while. There's a poet I've been reading now. I'm trying to think, of course, when you try to think of something, Liesl Mueller. Liesl Mueller's a wonderful poet, and I'd been acquainted with her when I lived in Chicago a little bit, and some of her poems are kind of story poems, and so are mine. And Heather McHugh as well, I've read recently, and gotten a lot of inspiration from their work. I find if I really want to do my best writing, what I need to do is read, because I think poetry is a language, almost like speaking in French or Spanish. You have to start thinking in poetry, and then you can write that way.
Well, tell me, when you took your trip to Paris, did you do any writing then?
I wrote every single day. I figured I owed it to Jess. I would write first thing in the morning and again at night. And I had purchased, we knew we were going 9 months before we actually went, so I bought 2 anthologies, one of just general French poets and one of modern French poets. So we read of course, in translation. I read French a little bit, but high school French. So Jim and I read and studied French poets while we were there, as well as the artists. And then I wrote something every day. I got quite a good bunch, a few finished poems, and then a lot of drafts and sketches.
Well, I used to take trips on the Amtrak, and that was beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
Because you just get all kinds of poems as you go across the country.
That sounds wonderful. I love that. Trains are very romantic.
Oh, yeah. Well, listen, on activism, how do you respond to those who, let's wait a minute, till that gets over with. How do you respond to those who say that poets should stick to poetry and stay out of politics?
Well, that's totally wrong. Poetry is all about life. And if you don't engage what's going on, your poetry is not very meaningful usually. I mean, you can write about the beauty of a flower, but how should I say? Some of the greatest poets use the beauty of a flower as a metaphor for the soul, or metaphor for suffering. We need to address that's why my nursing plays so strongly, I think, and makes my poems so much better. It's because a lot of my poetry it's about people who have suffered through incredible things, tried to find forgiveness at the end of life, or people that never did find forgiveness, or the healthcare system and how terribly it treats people these days.
Do you ever get any tales from talking to these people that inspire you to do something?
All the time. or well, activist. Oh yeah. Oh, I've written letters. Believe me, I've written letters and made phone calls. I do it all the time, advocating for people to get the care that they need. I have a state contract to do Medicare, Medicaid patients as well as other patients. Right now, I do something a little different than straight hospice, but there are many people that right here. I live down in Olympia, but around there, you wouldn't believe the poverty. The people that live in trailer parks that because they're really unable to access adequate nutrition and whatnot have suffered a great deal. And people say it's their fault. Some of them do have addictions, alcohol, drugs, otherwise. But there are sometimes reasons for that.
Yeah, but there are
too.
circumstances that cause this addiction.
That is absolutely
That's
correct.
what we need to address, I think.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, tell me, what do you make of the current corruption of language in government and business? Do you see a responsibility here for writers?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We should be standing in the forefront of what's wrong. Because, for one thing, one of the things that always goes by the wayside, it seems like, when we have hard economic times and whatnot, is freedom of thought, freedom of expression, the ability to find something beautiful even in the most horrible of situations. And we need to absolutely be sure that freedom of expression, freedom to read and believe and say is always preserved no matter what. My husband especially is really, really upset about how much the government knows about us and watches us and kind of limits what we're able to do, and that scares me too.
Well, that impresses me, the fact that your husband is a retired police detective or sergeant.
Yeah, he is.
And he's concerned. It's nice to have someone in the police department that looks after people too.
Oh yeah, he was always compassionate when he was, working as a police officer. He became a police officer to help people, not to penalize them.
Not brutalize people.
The
like
same
you
when
say.
I was a librarian. I had gotten many fights with superiors then because my idea was the books should all be off the shelf. We should have no books on. Everybody should be reading the books. All the books that are sitting there are doing no one any good. If someone has overdue fines, we'll figure out a way for them to pay them off or do whatever they need to do so they can check out books again, especially the children.
Oh,
Everybody needs to be able to get whatever information they need. And if people would come into the library and ask for topics that we didn't agree with, that made no difference at all. They had every right to read about what they needed to read about.
No, and I think our public libraries are so essential.
Oh, they are.
In the
They are.
culture. And,
Even now with the internet where everybody thinks they know everything,
Wow.
the public library is still a repository for thought and community engagement and involvement, a meeting place.
Right. Well, tell me, do you see the writer as a leader or as just a witness to particular events?
Oh, no. Certainly a witness and giving testimony. But really great writers are in the forefront. They're having ideas before people even knew that the ideas were available. So many ideas are a product of media and what we're supposed to think. Writers are supposed to be asking questions. I try to do that with every poem I write, have there be a question there that's either, not even answered, but just asked.
Something of substance to
Yeah,
say.
you got to start thinking about it. You got to think about this. None of us have all the answers, but we got to keep questioning, is this really right? What are they really saying? What are they going to do with this? We got to be asking questions all the time.
That's right. Well, what do you hope to accomplish as the most important thing in your work? Or what do you want people to know about what you've been working on?
A lot of my poems that I'm writing now, and the ones that are in my book, are poems of praise and honor. And they don't seem like that. Like, for instance, I have one about a wife who's forced to place her husband in a care situation because she simply can't care for him anymore, although it breaks her heart, and he accuses her every time she leaves him. But she's a hero. Or the caregivers that do really very difficult tasks all day long for $8 an hour and almost no recognition. Or people that have suffered incredible things and somehow find a way to make the suffering beautiful. And that's kind of what Believing the Body is all about. It certainly honors the soul, but if the soul isn't the body, what is the soul? That's a Walt Whitman quote.
Right. Well, listen, do you want to read a couple of 3 poems now?
I will.
Okay,
I will
go ahead.
indeed. I'll read, the first one I'm going to read is a poem I wrote about my friend Jess. And since I told you about him giving me my trip to Paris, he told me many, many stories about his life, and he had great stories of his life. But this is a true story. It's called Not My Father's Arms, for Jess. Tremor at the edge of memory, how the past keeps company as death comes home. As I sat with him that October afternoon, my friend who was dying revealed his worst recollection. Not the backwards premonition I expected of war, fractures, the premature passing of his only daughter, but an evening, he told me, when he was 4 or 5. His mother gave permission for him to meet his father, the nightly ritual of return from work. He had run toward salmon-colored sunset, through scents of suppers seasoned with lost countries. He had run as only a small boy can, all fists and knees, tall as what he knew of manhood. 2 figures approached in conversation, facing each other, backed by a sun, ashen now, past its glory. In the shift of light, they saw him, small blur of home hurtling toward them. One knelt, opening dark arms wide enough for a child to enter and press against cool wool. He had dashed, his arms a matching gesture of width and pleasure, until, enfolded against a broad chest, he smothered in alarm. These were not his father's arms. The face bending down was bearded, the hands calloused. His terror went beyond nightmare, ache, the loss of any dear possession, sobs lasting long after the other man, his true parent, lifted him onto strong shoulders. He never forgot. That accidental betrayal haunted every sidewalk, persisted into the risk of this place, this homecoming, in which his own body had become unfamiliar, where every day he might wake into an unknown love. It's strange sometimes how, as we get older, our childhood comes closer. We remember things that we didn't know we even remembered. This poem has the line that is the title of the book. And it's true too, about home health patients I had. One thing I did when I did home health and hospice simultaneously for the first few years. When someone would come home from the hospital, I'd send out a visiting nurse that would tell them what to do and how to do it. Okay. This one is called, They Had Already Made Love. Well into February, the waning winter, down the lane to the home closest to the river, I drive with my home health wisdoms. What to do after your chest is cracked open, the heart's blood revalved and remapped, a new electric pendulum embedded. How to believe the body. They sit together, husband and his almost widow. Their many years in pictures and chipped paint scattered around them. Their hands cling knuckle white to this side of nothingness. I open my nursing bags of scopes and ohmmeters, devices to pronounce him sound 3 days beyond the hospital. Then begin the God lists. Thou shalt not lift. No fats. No warm baths. No sex for at least 6 weeks. I glance up and meet their startled blush. I know they've already done it. Consummated resurrection, the nurture of lust. I pretend not to notice. Tell them to live well, do what feels right, and drive away rejoicing that the heart, truly mended, never waits. That's a true poem too. I was amazed at the medication that man was on.
Well, tell me, you're a good-looking gal. When you were doing nurse work, did you get any of these guys try to flirt with you?
Oh yeah, but that's all right. You know, I always too, still to this day, I always kind of dress up before I go to visit someone. I wear nice clothes and put on makeup because I want them to feel special when the nurse comes. Because a lot of these people, their worst fear is revulsion, is feeling that now that they're incontinent and throwing up and their bodies are fading, that people won't love them anymore. And it's a very real fear. And I have a couple of poems about that. I didn't bring them, and the most vivid one is not in this collection, but it's true, it's a real fear, and I want them to know that they're just as lovable. Their soul shines through no matter what they look like or what might be happening to them. Because it's true. Actually, after Jess ended up passing away when he was 101, I was working at a facility, and we had a very nice young man. He lived in his own home till he was 101.
Gee.
Yeah, it was amazing. But he had caregivers that came in and helped, and the young man that helped him bathe was there. And he called me, and Jess had just said that he was short of breath and wanted to wait a minute before he got in the shower. And the caregiver turned around in the bed, and he'd passed. So he called me, and I drove right over. And I swear he looked like he was 40. It was
Really?
like a miracle. It was amazing. I'm going to read, I think, one more poem that is a story that.
Okay, and
someone
then
told.
after that, I'll ask you some more questions on writing, and then if you've got something else you can read, you can do that too.
Would you rather do? You can ask me the questions now.
Okay, let's
Okay,
go.
let's
This
do
is
that.
this has to do with the process.
Okay.
How do you go about the writing process? Do you have any particular place or time of day or other habits that help you focus on writing?
Well, like I said, now I mostly write in the morning because it's the quietest time. I used to be a night writer. I wrote in the evening or at night because that's when inspiration struck. But now it seems to come more often first thing in the morning. But I have notebooks in my purse and in my pockets and in my car because I drive from home to home to visit people. And I know that I've truly had a magnificent idea if I have to pull over by the side of the road and write down that line.
You need a dictator.
Yes. Well, you know, I tried that. I got one, but that thing on my phone, this person is not poetic. It'll tell you how to find the nearest McDonald's, but if you try to dictate a poetic line, forget it. I guess I need an actual recorder. But anyway, I do keep all sorts of lines, and then I try to find some time to actually put them together and make sense out of them.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes I start a poem and I try to think of little lines or things or even things I see through the day and stick it in to see if it fits.
Mm.
So the poems are kind of like that. I try to be organized about writing. If you don't make the intention to write and set aside time, it won't happen because people have to be fed and the laundry has to be done and you have to take the cat to the vet and you have to work. And so poetry, which is something beautiful and wonderful and enjoyable, tends to be the last thing you do. So that's why these days I try to make it the first thing that I do. It makes for a better day that way.
I understand. Well, tell me, how much do you do much editing?
Yes, I edit all the time. Almost never does a poem arrive whole cloth. And usually I cut it down. Poems are supposed to be spare. Those, especially the first one I read, was much longer than what I usually write. Because a poem is imagistic. There are little snatches of beautiful language that give the reader a whole field of vision. So usually I write and get rid of about 2/3 of it, and that's a poem.
Yeah, that's the way you do it, right? Well, tell me, do you write for a particular audience?
Sometimes I write to people and about people. I think I always have at least one person that the poem is for. A lot of my poems are literally for somebody. Somebody has inspired me. My poems are, I have this thing on my, I have all these affirmations that keep me, and on my bathroom mirror now it says, I want to write truth through beauty as expressed in the human condition. And that's mostly what I write about is the human condition, at least right now. So
Yeah.
there's usually one person I'm writing to or about.
Mm. Well, do you see any new influences or trends emerging in writing?
Yes, I think poems are much more colloquial now again. We seem to go from lofty language to basic speech and kind of back and forth. I've seen. Oh, Lucia Perillo is another amazing poet who lives in Olympia, and
Oh, I know
her
her,
books are stunning. And I've gotten a lot of tips from her. She puts the weirdest things, that juxtaposes the weirdest things in her poems that don't seem to go together. You know what I mean? She starts out talking about one thing and then slips in something about science because she's a scientist.
Uh-huh.
And but it all goes together at the end, and that's kind of cool to bring in kind of disparate images and have them all work together in one. So I found other poets are doing that as well.
Hmm. Well, tell me, what do you think about all the proliferation of writing courses, competitions? Do you
Wow.
think that academic degrees help in writing?
It's very cool to have a time you can set aside just to study, because like I said, you won't do it if you don't, unless you're really motivated. And all these distance degrees and stuff, that's obviously very few people can spend 2 years of their lives just going and writing and reading poetry anymore. And so having distance learning, when you can kind of do it on your own, is a big deal. And, you know, I never, believe it or not, all these years that I've written poetry and whatnot, I'd never really gone to a poetry conference or workshop. I've gone to day-long ones, but partly because I always had a family. I've had kids for a long time. I have a lot of kids. But anyway, make a long story even longer. Not this past summer, but the summer before, I saw one advertised called The Healing Art of Writing. And it was for healthcare professionals and writers, and it was in the Bay Area. And I went to that in July of 2012, and it was like amazing. I made so many friends, so many connections, and it was a lot of people that were writers, but also they were doctors, there were nurses, there were patients, cancer survivors, caregivers. It was just an amazing conference. And that really helped me, and I realized I need to take time to actually physically be present with people.
So you think it is important for writers to keep company with other writers?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
Absolutely. You can do it on your own, but it sure is harder. And you get a lot of inspiration from being in the presence of other writers, or artists even.
Oh, yeah.
I have more friends close friends that are graphic artists than I do writers per se, for some reason.
Well, you know, I spent probably 20 years as a stockbroker and investment banker.
Yeah.
And I find that writers and poets, I find them much more intelligent people than what I found in the investment community. You know,
I'll
buy,
agree with
sell,
that.
hold, it doesn't take much. You know, you're concentrating on one thing and you don't have the broad perspective. And you know, what's his name? J. Paul Getty, the big oil man. He says, give me a person that's trained in liberal arts and I'll teach him the business.
Right, I agree with that.
Because liberal arts, you know, you learn to think.
You
That's-
do.
that's the
I tell
difference.
my children that, a couple of them who are struggling with careers and should we even try college because it's so expensive. And I said, yes, you need to learn critical thinking. You need to learn about beauty and openness of thought. It's definitely worth it to be educated,
Oh, yeah.
even if you're going to be a plumber.
Right. Well, tell me, what do you consider the most important thing in your work, and what do you want people to know about your work?
The most important thing of my work is that it honors people for who they are and where they are. And there's always a person in each of my poems somewhere, even if it's just me, but usually it's some specific person. I've been so inspired by the people I've cared for and just other friends that I see. A lot of my poems are to honor.
Mm-hmm.
And like my husband pointed out the other day, he said, I think what your poems really are is a tool for vision. And I think all of us want to see beyond and into something special, the quest to know the soul and all that kind of stuff. But certainly, I don't know if my poems are quite that great, but it's an aim. You know, you try to make it transcend.
Well, it's a legacy that you leave to the literary bank of the world.
Yeah, well, that's well said.
And, you know, because the guy makes all kinds of money, and when he's gone, what's left? You know?
Oh, yeah, absolutely,
Right.
That's true.
Well, what advice would you give a young person who wants to be a writer?
Well, you got to learn the language. Like I said, poetry, any kind of writing, but certainly poetry is a language unto itself. And I don't mean just words. It's the way you express things. So you got to read. Go to poetry readings. Go to the library. All the books are free there. You know, and then try your hand at it. And try to send them out. It's a good, rejection. A good friend of mine always just call it keeping his mailbox pregnant. Now I think you keep your computer pregnant because most of it's online. But by it forces you to do it and make them better. When I get a poem back. A lot of times it's because it didn't fit with the journal, but maybe the poem isn't as good as it could be. It needs a little polishing. Need to look at it again.
Yeah. You know, my experience was you send stuff out, and nothing but rejections. And all of a sudden, for some damn reason,
It clicks.
they all start clicking.
It does. It's done that for me. I've gotten a little more, I study, you got to study the journal. Each journal is a work of art in itself. The editor has something in mind he's trying to create by putting these pieces together. So your poem has to fit. So you do have to read the journal first somehow. Now you're lucky because you can get more examples online. You used to have to subscribe. Now you can. I do subscribe to journals though because they need the money, and you got to put your money where your passion is.
Oh yeah. No, the internet has been wonderful for gathering information and
Yes.
even just to get guidelines of, you know,
Oh,
if
yeah.
you want to send something, you just Google it and it gives you the guidelines. So much faster and easier. Well, tell me, Joanne, is there any question that you wish that I'd asked and didn't?
No, you were great. You're a great interviewer. I don't think there's any other profound wisdom I have to impart.
Well, listen, feel free to read any poems you want to while you're here. We might as well capture as much as we can because when we do these radio programs, we pick, you know, we got a subject and we can pull it out of the file. So if you got a
Okay.
whole bunch more to read, feel free to.
Well, I'll read several more,
Okay.
certainly. I wanted to read this one because it's an interesting example. I had a patient who told me this story. He said that he actually was present when this took place. He used to visit his grandparents in Montana. His grandpa had worked in the copper mines and had lung disease, and his grandma was a farm wife. And he told me this story in very vivid detail. It was such a compelling story, I felt I had to write about it. This poem is appeared in Chest, which is the magazine of the pulmonary physicians, American Association of Pulmonary Physicians, and you'll see why. It's called Deep Mercy. Copper, his life given for this shine. Now he goes even deeper into the wet collapse of lungs, hunting desperate for any vein of air. The miner, retired, slumps over his coffee mug, gasping like the rainbow trout he cast on Montana's riverbanks. She is at the range, stirring, watching sideways, her air wrinkling into his, so that as she forces out breath, she panics and calls it back. She packed his lunch for 35 years, worrying while he headed for the shafts, where, beyond daylight, he harvested the stuff of wire, bullets, and pennies. He is coughing again, shaking the table, sloshing coffee hot onto his hands. She moves across the kitchen then, knowing he is ready. May I lie upon you one more time, my husband? Weary as habit, he follows her up impossible stairs, stopping at every other one to wheeze and pant, collect enough wind for one more tread toward the room where he hasn't slept for years. The ceiling sighs, the bed springs creak once, then again, as she drapes her body over his, presses down, breasts to chest, so that no amount of will can make it rise. Silence, then weeping. An old remedy, a kindness, really. I want to read this poem in honor of the caregivers and the spouses of people who are ill, who have to make decisions for their lives, and that isn't an easy thing to do. This is called Leaving Him There, for Joanna. When they take him to the bathroom, although he's already wet himself, I sneak out heavy doors and hurry through bitter rain to my car. I drive 10 blocks the wrong way before I pull over and search for any map to reconfigure the synapses pointing home. That empty place, that weakness, those floors from which no one can rise. the darkness of that final night before I divorced him more surely than any law. I had tried to lift him from couch to bed, but his bold marching mind had forgotten his quivering legs, and we both fell. I twisted under him in some long-forgotten sex position, the devil's parody of passion. We lay like that, tangled and aching, him angry and confused, me sending mental pleas to children in far cities, to acquaintances, paramedics, any god who might be tuned into this desperate venture. At 2 a.m., a kind neighbor knocked, seeing lights still on. Now I've signed papers, and he lives with strangers who work for far less than they deserve. My penance is my daily visit, when the blue bite of his eyes orders me to take him back to the home I have stolen, to hand over what little health I still possess, to give up courage, which is all, short of dying, I have left. I felt so sorry for that woman. I helped take care of her husband in this adult family home where she'd had to place him. He was very confused, but every time, she came every day faithful, and every day he wanted to go home. And she had to sneak out of there, and she would be crying every time, and I thought, But she was brave enough to come, because many of the people don't want to face that, and they don't visit.
Sounds like that's a tough job for a poet who is very perceptive and very sensitive.
It is a tough job, but someone needed to tell her story.
Yeah.
Bless her heart. He's passed away now. I'm going to read this. This is a more imagistic poem. I also write about my past and my ancestors, and one of my favorite subjects is my grandmother, Esther, who was a very difficult person. She was actually a professional medium and psychic. Very interesting lady, and I've written more poems lately about her. She was, my grandparents lived very near us, and we saw them almost every day. She was a scary lady for a lot of reasons, and was very troubled all her life. Tried to commit suicide a couple times. It was tough as a child to relate to her. Mm-hmm. But I've come to appreciate her as I've grown older, and so a little bit of her sneaks into my poems now and then. So anyway, this poem was just accepted by Rhino, which is a nice magazine out of Chicago. It's called The Mannequin's Comb. This morning I washed a dying woman's hair. She sighed with caress, remembering. Tonight I bathe a baby whose scalp is still birthing its brain, bone cupping trust like an unfolding flower. Outside, sweet peas sing. My grandmother worked in her sister's millinery shop. Lace and feathers, straw and felt. She shaped spring out of satin and autumn's velvet from the tilt of a brim, all women mysterious. In the picture window each weekday, she arrayed the mannequin's pale oval, creating face from the shadow of a veil, emotion with the teeth of her comb. My hands know so many small gestures. This morning I washed a woman to her bone, lying when I said that hair didn't come away, that it was only thread and could be mended. Although I lived for a while in Illinois, but mostly I'm a Northwest poet, but I don't write a lot necessarily about the Northwest, but I have a couple of poems that are more oriented toward this beautiful country where we live, because I certainly love my trees and my ocean and even my rain. So I wrote this poem recently. Up in the northern hemisphere, of course, when you look at the sky, Orion is a prominent constellation in winter, but he goes away in the summertime, and you can only see him down south. So a friend of mine who's been struggling with insomnia told me that she can now see Orion when she wakes up. So I wrote this poem for Betty. It's called Orion Returns to the North Country. 2 a.m. She wakes to his soft step. Worry stalks her, a sentinel sense. All women mourn the shape of warriors. Summer and he left her, confident that blossoming then ripeness would be guardian enough. Now with autumn on the march, he resumes his watch. Is this why she woke, left southern curtains open? His belt first gives him away, 3 equal stars of father, child, husband, love, and at the corners, Betelgeuse and Rigel. His sword, visible in winter's breath, gathers more stars than flying dreams can reach for. When astronomers pointed the most powerful telescope into the blackest space, they discovered the richest field of worlds. She nods her welcome, knowing he will appear earlier and earlier now on the heels of sunset. Tomorrow he will read over her shoulder. Soon wood smoke will rise into his parted arms.
Go right ahead, I'm gonna switch your balls.
Let's see, what's another one? I became a nurse, like I said in the interview, when I was older. And it was much scarier than becoming a librarian. Actually having to interact with someone who's suffering is really scary. You don't want to cause them more pain. You don't want to do anything wrong. And I vividly remember my first patient. His name was Sylvan. He had diabetes and they just had to amputate his leg. And so after they'd, given us a few courses, they take us into a nursing home and turn us loose on these poor, unsuspecting people. So I wrote this poem as a tribute to my first patient, for Sylvan. He was my first. How I learned nursing. How I accepted in these white corridors the summons of pain and sent it back softened. Moonrise on cliffstone. Morning and the lists of tasks tremble in my hand. I am to bathe him, spoon pills between chapped lips, murmuring their names in litanies that neither of us yet understand. With a minted nurse, I am to change the bandage where they have sawed away his leg. I have never been so afraid. But this fear is not revulsion or blood horror. It's adequacy that curls inside a hesitant child wounding again with clumsiness, for well-intentioned love is never enough. I envy her quick hands, how the ace gauzes are off and on again almost before I exhale. Tight, she says, we must pull the skin tight. I try awkwardly, apologizing under my breath. She whips the tape in place. But it is me that he stares at afterwards, eyes hazel as a woodland stream with leaf fall. I'll do better tomorrow, I promise. But we both know this is not quite true, that nothing is as tender as the terror of first touch. This is one of the newest poems I've written, and it's always a risk to read that because it might not be good yet, but I think I'll read it anyway because it's about my grandfather. My grandfather that was married to the psychic grandma. That guy had a tough road up, believe me. He was a farmer, and he loved being a farmer. He lost his farm during the Depression and worked he was also a stonemason. He and his brother-in-law did that, and then they did that once they came back to Seattle. He was a bricklayer. But he never liked it as well as farming. We went back to Eastern Washington. He lived in the little town of Reardon. And we drove through Reardon recently where my grandpa and my great uncle had built a stone church, actually there, still standing. So the name of this poem is The Stonemasons. Not out of faith, but stone. 2 men, atheists both, built the town's church. Rock rivered to the smoothness of loaves, heft and sweat, the mortar. This was no cathedral, no tower for bells, no crimson or indigo windows. In those hard times they toiled for food alone and a place to sleep where silence breathed its deep calm. They seldom spoke, though there was always communion between them. July sun called the house of God upwards. No, neither of them believed. The war had been too hard. They married sisters, lived in the city, and after one of them lost his mind, the other sat daily at the bedside, accepting, while the women prayed. He recalled then some remnant of Bible lore from childhood when Christ, fasting, was tempted by the devil to turn rocks into bread, and he had refused. Let stones be stones, indifferent to weather, worship what breaks a man and what holds him still. Here's a nice poem. I thought, when I was putting my book, Believing the Body, together, there were so many sad poems about sick people. I thought, people want to shoot themselves in the head if they read this book, so we got to find some more lighthearted, loving, and cheerful ones to stick in there. So this is a nice poem. I used to have, most of my life I had hair I could sit on, had very long hair. Now it's shorter, but anyway, this is called Braiding at Nightfall. Ritual of river in the after dark of murmur, he braids her hair. On the still warm wooden porch planks, they mime caress, her sitting cross-legged at his feet, him bending to gather a yard or more of russet, as alive as liquid. He divides it into thirds and crosses strands, feeling the clean, fine pull of water sliding over his fingers, making them smooth, almost musical. He had fished there many times, today in fact, and while he whipped the river, she picked wild blackberries, her hair gathered at the neck, out of its braid. It had rippled down her back, like the perfect smithing of the water's morning silver. Under his touch now, it yields lightning, end over end over end. From the damp underbrush, frogs make the sound of stroked combs, little white-bellied frogs with throats that swell with the wealth of night. Wind suffers in the highest treetops, and the forest makes its almost human noises, as if the unseen always means more. She sighs. He bands the finished plate. She leans her cheek against his knee, and together they listen. The blind silken will of the current, in his hands, her hair. I have another tree poem. I'm very fond of trees. We have a wonderful bunch of trees all around our house where we live. And this is actually a true story. Actually, this tree wasn't struck by lightning. Someone actually cut it down, but it sounds more romantic. We were very, very angry at these people that cut down this tree. That's another long story I probably should write about sometime. But this is called Sky of Four Sisters. 4 firs marked the northern edge of our acres, our welcome. We watched them for miles, calling us home. Our warriors, they shielded us from the worst of winter storms, moss cushioning our ice. In summer, we camped beneath their feathered shade, lazy with evergreen breezes. We live at Four Sisters, we would say, and everyone knew our place. So that after a lightning strike took down the easternmost tree, we didn't change our address, still seeing her sway like a Curlian print, pinnacle home to falcon, crow, needles a mist of cocoon spin. 4 sisters on a mailbox. How memory continues a sacred name. How some bonds have such deep roots that even the wind honors their space. poem about my father, in case you ever need a father poem.
Great.
He was a great guy. He grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia, like I was telling Barb, and very, very poor. Very poor. His father was a coal miner for a while, tried various things, never very successful. They had 8 kids in a little tiny house with no bathroom, like that. And so he never really got any schooling. He got drafted during the Second World War and became a meat cutter in the Pacific, which was kept him alive, probably. Anyway, but he never, and so when he came back, married my mama, he continued being a meat cutter, but he hated it, to be honest. And one day he just came home and told her he was going to build houses for a living, and that's what he did for 6 years until he got cancer and died. But he died happy doing what he wanted to do, which is always a lesson to me in my life. If you really want to do something with your whole soul, for heaven's sakes, go do it.
Yeah.
But anyway, this poem, though, is more like about him and what he loved. And it's called My Father the Butcher. My father the butcher loved children, street baseball, and the way fur stroked over bones. He taught the neighbor's mongrel dog to dance to the sound of his whistle. After Sunday morning breakfast, he fed the wild deer leftover pancakes from his hands. My father the butcher loved poker, Christmas, and the sound an owl makes just after dusk. Once he chased a white chicken that escaped the poultry truck 5 miles down First Avenue and brought it home as a pet. It told us about every sunrise. My father the butcher kept a yellow parakeet named Buddy, a small green turtle, and a rabbit with red eyes. Every morning on his way to work, he fed the sway-backed horse in the rainy field an apple. He learned his profession in the army, fed a Catholic family, fainted at his first sight of blood. That's true. We had all those pets all the time. It's always bringing some new pet home for my mother to take care of. Let's see.
Is he still alive?
No, he died in 1960. Bless his heart. Let's see. I'll read just a couple. I'll read the one that won the award in San Francisco.
Oh.
That would be a good one. It's called Seamstress Masters Her Craft. Her life is cloth. It is how she sees. Draped or fitted, each body seeks its narrow rainbow of texture and motion, weight and weave. She learned from her grandmother who reared her, who could design a gown, tailor a suit after one sitting the same way a musician can recreate at the keyboard after hearing a melody once. Her schooling was not at machines, although machines have their use, or in stitches, although she knows 200 by heart, but in museums, on Sundays, viewing the masters, how they arrayed saints, angels, nymphs, and virgins, kings, peasants, and gods, each in his own folds. She crawled into sleeves, lifted a hem, turned a queen around. Back in her workspace, on an upper story, facing east or west where light is at its most suggestive, she envisions the scissor's first bite and begins. Working for hours, days, a week, time with no mind, only fingers, until she knows the pattern so well that each garment sews itself, a soul worn inside out, sacred to the skin. They did it through twice while they danced it. It was very nice. I was very proud that they had done that. Maybe I'll read one more.
Okay.
I'm getting a little hoarse. This one is different. Excuse me. It also won first place. It won first place in the Third Wednesday Journals contest this year. It came about because I guess I hadn't realized that you couldn't hear in space because there was no atmosphere for sound to travel in. And you know, my husband does his UFOs, and he also gets involved in a lot of astronomy. People were talking about that. we were talking about this, and it fascinated me. And it seems somehow wrong that you can't hear things in space. So anyway, I wrote this poem called The Planet Shakespeare. Ask any astronaut. No symphony, no second act, no stanzas. In the vacuum of the universe, science states that listening is impossible. No atmosphere exists in the distances between stars for sound waves to travel. Arias fade long before the plane of the Milky Way, unless some heretic, facing the vast deafness, translates a line or tone into passion which transcends Earth essential gases, to hit celestial winds and roll into a planetoid of sopranos, a blue moon of cellos, satellites of the chorus of the first song that an ironworker sang to his soulmate. Shakespeare's plays become a galaxy, each one a separate planet with famous soliloquies creating rivers, lakes, oceans, and sonnets spreading seeds that might be Edens, while to-bes and not-to-bes coalesce into meteors with no destination but an ongoing sigh. The final line of every masterpiece finds the furnace of a white-hot star and becomes a solar flare seen 500 years from now by an astronomer who discovers these manifestations of exquisite noun and note. He will weep that such worlds were denied throughout time, that the ear was thought to be lesser than the eye. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much, Joanne. It's very good reading.